So let me go ahead and start the recording for class for those that end up missing class today. Um, and also I'm going to record this class so that way you have a opportunity to look back and also reference this presentation. Um, Instead of posting slides, I will post the video of this class on Canvas. Okay, so as I said earlier, the ePortfolio is becoming more and more popular within higher education. If you will, I'd like for you to consider using it as a dynamic document. ePortfolios are not only a static document or static piece of um, a piece of history of who you are, but more so it's a dynamic document as you develop as an engineer, as a student, and as a lifelong learner. Before we move forward, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Um, and before we dive into the material, I want for us to sort of do a little quick reflection. So if you will, if you haven't done so already, please take a sheet of paper out. I have some series of questions for you to consider and answer for yourself. Now, when you answer these questions, you could type it, take notes on it, but big picture, make sure you hang on to it because what you're going to create is something that you could build and incorporate into your ePortfolio. If you haven't done so already, you could add to it or build it accordingly. Okay, and so let's see here. Can everyone see, again, thumbs up, can everyone see the screen that says what is an ePortfolio? Okay, great. And so when we think about an ePortfolio, I want for you to consider a series of questions. The first one is this: how do you define engineering? Okay, so as an engineer, what does that look like? Okay, and if you could quickly jot down what a couple of notes or some words that you would use to identify how you define an engineer. The second question is, who helped you frame that definition? Identify 3 people. And when we think about it, it's either a lifelong event, your recent co-op, or someone along the way between the time that you thought about being an engineer to now, someone helped you frame that definition. So who are those people? Write those down. Next, list your co-op experiences, okay? And just list the company and the role, right? Later on, you'll be able to delve into this a little bit further, but when we think about your co-op experiences, what are those, right? And then finally, what's your ideal engineering position, right? So when you put on your adult uniform, whether it be khakis and a shirt or an actual uniform, what would be the ideal engineering position? Is it someone that's behind a desk? Is it someone that's on the floor? Is it someone that's interacting with a bunch of people? Is it someone that's working remotely? What is that ideal definition? Okay. And the reason why I'm asking you to reflect on this is because when we think about who you are as an engineer, again, this course is focused on being reflective of yourself and reflective of your experiences. Okay. And so when you answer these questions, right, what I'm asking you to consider is how you define engineering. And there is research out there there's research out there that identifies that how you define engineering is influenced by your previous work experiences, but more importantly, individuals along the way that helped you frame that definition. Many students, as early as the 5th grade, start defining engineering as fixing things, building things, right? And then later on, that fixing and building becomes a little more complicated to include specific processes and software. And then we start identifying companies, right? And so how you define engineering is influenced by, you know, your our previous context or context that has helped you along the way. Next, when we think about how those two, the individuals in your work experiences, they then focus on, they then help you um, help influence your goals, right? And so when we think about your ideal engineering position, what we're thinking about here is, what are your goals for the future? I'm not talking about 5, 10 years from now. I'm talking about in the immediate sense right after graduation. Okay. Again, because you need context in your previous experience to influence the future. So when we think about your ideal engineering position at this point in time, moving forward after graduation, what is that, right? And so when we think about it, it all goes back to that definition of what it is to be an engineer. Okay. The reason why I'm asking this of you is because as you build out your e-portfolio, there is a specific section that, and I'll show you in a moment, that sort of helps share who you are. It provides the viewer a glimpse of, how you define being an engineer and what expectations you have of an engineering position moving forward, right? So hang on to those notes along, and refer back to it from time to time as we build out your e-portfolio. And I talked about this earlier. So again, what is an e-portfolio? An e-portfolio, is a static document, as I mentioned earlier. But if we had to take a specific snapshot in time of who you are, where you are, and what you're doing, you have documentation of your learning, right? And so and the key thing is that it presents evidence of your skills and experiences. So in another sense, while you define what it is to be an engineer, what makes you a unique engineer? Okay. And again, it's based on those combinations of skills, experiences, and how you integrate those skills and experiences into who you are, right? In another sense, an e-portfolio is a process where we're constantly reflecting, right? Again, this course is based on reflection and recontextualization of who you are. So when we think about your definition of an engineer, how is that reflective of your experiences, and how is that reflective of your ideal position after graduation? But at the same time, also, it's a final product. It's a showcase, right? And so right now we're using the ePortfolio as a showcase of your experiences within the specific area of co-op. Now, for some students, an ePortfolio may be important in terms of showcasing your work, your skills as a designer, or it provides additional context as it relates to applying for graduate school. So those, when we think about an ePortfolio as a product, again, they're snapshots in time, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. I mentioned the ePortfolio as a process, and really it's this idea of, first and foremost, knowing yourself. But as you go along and as you take the courses and develop, um, you know, showcase pieces, you're collecting those pieces of showcase pieces as evidence of your learning, evidence of your experience. The reflection is how you integrate that. How do you integrate that to who you are in the present moment? And then you're constantly doing that. So this process that you see here of collecting, reflecting, refining is an iterative process. It is constantly moving, right? To the point where you are presenting. There may be a point in time where you're sharing your portfolio to say to me, or you're to the college, or if you're applying to graduate school, you can share this as a snapshot of who you are, of your learning, right? And that's the presentation piece. The key thing here is when we present, the question becomes, is your presentation, right? When you are presenting your portfolio, is the presentation unique enough that differentiates you from your peers? Number one. And number two, is the presentation, the showcase portfolio, ref truly reflective of who you are as an individual? So that's the one thing to keep in mind. And when you think about this iterative process when it comes to e-portfolio development. Now there are many cases where we go through examples, and there are many cases where we use the portfolio as a specific snapshot. And so the first example is showcasing a trip. And so this is an example of an e-portfolio page for our study tour that we have every year, where we take a group of students to Italy and Spain, and we visit the various engineering and manufacturing companies out there. And students reflect on the experience, and they also interpret what they got out of it. Okay. The second example is more of a summary. And so this is an example of a year in review. And for students that are in the University Honors Program, the ePortfolio has been a standard way of reflection for over 10 years, actually since 2008. And this portfolio page is actually a year in review of what happened, in sort of recounting everything, and sort of, and again, reflecting on how those points in time are important. When we think about those points in time and we actually bring it up and reflect on it, when we bring up these points in time, they're the most salient experiences that we have. And so when we put it on text, and we actually capture it in text, we're capturing not only the moment, but more so identifying for ourselves what is important. The question then becomes, why is that important, right? So when we think about, again, that reflection, it is an iterative process, right? And then finally, the final piece is more so focused on the showcase of the entire experience. And so this is actually a portfolio of a student that is actually summarizing all her internship experiences, and is able to tell a narrative, right, of how she became a better designer, how she became a better marketing student. And so when we think about, going for the final showcase portfolio, it is a true reflection of who you are, again, but more importantly, how all your experiences define who you are as a professional. Okay. So when we think about it from a learning standpoint, you're actually identifying how you've learned, what you've learned. From a professional standpoint, you're showcasing how you are differentiated amongst your peers, but more importantly, how you have used your professional experiences to contribute to how they've contributed to a definition of who you are as a professional engineer. Okay. So those are some things to keep in mind. Now, when we think about portfolios, the digital presence, and so forth, the constant question I constantly get asked is, how is this different from social media? And I will point out that when we think about the different types of social media that's out there, right? There's a lot. Show of hands in terms of by clicking and reacting on the lower right screen. How many of you can honestly identify maybe 5 social media platforms that you have access to? Okay. How about 10? All right. How about 20? All right. Now, when we think about the social media, this is an example of the social media map as of 2019, right? And as you can see here, when we think about social media, it is very vast, right? When I took an inventory of this, and what I mean by social media access, you have a password and a username, right? And when I looked at this last time, I had 32 different social media um, social media touch points. Okay, and when you think about all of these social media platforms that you see on the screen, how many of these are actually platforms that you identify with, or said differently, use on a regular basis? So, you know, some people may think Spotify may not be a social media platform, but when you think about the sharing of music lists or following specific artists, that is a social media relationship. When we think about the number of TikToks that you create, right? That is considered sharing of yourself. You're presenting yourself whenever you pose a video, right? So anytime when there is a specific interaction, not only with an individual, but with a group of people within a digital space, that is considered social media, right? And so some questions to keep in mind are these. When you differentiate your ePortfolio with the rest of your social media, would your friends be interested in your research? Maybe, maybe not. Um, would you want your employer to know what you enjoy doing on the weekends? Or said differently, um, would your grandparents, who are a generation older than you, would they want to know what you post, right? What kind of employee do you want to portray yourself to be, right? So these are questions to keep in mind when we think about our social media interaction. As it relates to specifically within the career space, right? The on the right side of the screen are the actual social media platforms um, within the recruiting space, or professional space. So I always mention Indeed, Glassdoor, LinkedIn, but there are other places, other platforms out here like Career Builder, Google for Jobs, Smart Recruiters are a couple. And so the thing to keep in mind with this is when you look at this list of recruiting platforms, right, as it relates to your job search, not only for a co-op job, but also after graduation, this is a potential list of recruiting sites to access, but more importantly, um, visit and be an active participant in that space. Okay. Yeah, the other way to differentiate how you present yourself in a professional sense and personally, it's actually a sociological term called the presentation of self in everyday life by Irving Goffman, right? And so when I present myself as a researcher and as an educator and as a professional, this is how I look, right? Um, and it's very different from how I portray myself in a serious context as an educator, where this is my Vita, this is my digital Vita, right? Um, and I go into detail about what I do, and also my research, and some of my high, and some of the things that I've done professionally and academically in terms of presenting my research within the professional space, right? But then it's also different as it relates to my Facebook page, right? Or my my Pinterest board. If you noticed um, on my syllabus for the class, I've posted my Pinterest board, and I have a specific one for job searches. But if you delve deeper into my profile, there's other aspects of my life that are very different compared to what you just saw in the other in the ePortfolio and my ePortfolio and my LinkedIn profile. Okay, something to keep in mind. Overall, when we think about the development of ePortfolios and and so forth, um, it is used in professional development research. It is considered a high impact practice. not only because of the active portfolio development, but it's more so the reflection of your experiences, and how you're integrating what you write about yourself in the here and now to who you are in the future. Okay. It is also used as an assessment tool. So I've done research using ePortfolio assessment, and we tend to do this ePortfolio research to gain an understanding of how students develop, mature, and really how they understand and portray their learning within the context of either professional development, career education, engineering education, and so forth, right? And then in another sense, how you portray yourself, the words that you use, okay, does impart a sense of identity, and a little bit about that in a moment. So, one of the things to keep in mind is, when we think about our identities, it's more so, um, and it's becoming more and more prevalent as the technology is enhanced and how the technology moves forward. Um, how we portray ourselves and the identities that we put out there in its totality, okay, provides a different perspective of who you are as an individual. Okay. The thing to keep in mind is, as it relates to technology and learning, the amazing thing about ePortfolios is that we are able to compartmentalize our learning, not only in terms of who we are as professionals, but also our personal lives. And so, in a sense, we tend to segment our ourselves, right? And again, that presentation of self is up to the individual, right? And as we dig a little deeper in terms of what to include, why you include it, how you interpret how the responses people give you, what does that tell you about who you are, right? And so one of the amazing things about ePortfolios is that it promotes a practice, right? Of it promotes a practice of how we interpret the reactions that people give us, right? From a social aspect and social development, that reaction is important now more than ever, namely because of the fact that when we look at the way we work and the way we operate right now we're um, you know doing this remotely, and we're not in a classroom. There's little interaction amongst us, right? Except when I ask you to raise your hand. But that's when you're interacting with me. But when you interact with others, that's a different story altogether, right? And so when we think about the presentation of self within any portfolio, it's very different, right? Something to keep in mind. So what I'm asking you to include, I'm asking you in your portfolio to include an introduction of who you are, artifacts or evidence, um, and then also go a little deeper, right? So when we think about the idea of what to include, if you were applying to an employer or applying to grad school, and you want to showcase your specific skills and experiences, what would that look like? Okay, something to keep in mind. Um, and I mentioned, earlier, why should you care? And it's for these reasons. Okay, the big thing that I offer you is that specifically for this class, the ePortfolio offers you a sandbox to practice how you would respond to potential interview questions. Okay, so in another sense, if someone was asking you what is your professional philosophy on engineering, we talked about that a little earlier, and how your definition of engineering is informed by your experiences, by individuals, and your ideal position, right? And so in a sense, your ePortfolio is a way for you to practice the narrative of how you would respond to potential interview questions. In another sense, for those of you that are thinking about graduate school or thinking about moving into academia, when we think about your experiences, how do your experiences and also your definition of engineering provide potential for future research and future learning? Okay, so if you spent 3 semesters at Gulfstream and 2 semesters, um, with Ethicon, when we think about the trends in engineering from your perspective, what are some potential research strands that would be helpful for you? Or what would you see as potential research opportunities? Okay. So, again, the ePortfolio is a dynamic piece of who you are. In another sense, you're also building a sense of professional identity. Okay. And, you know, it, I'm not saying this is you forever, or this is your definition, the definition of you, right? You're the one building it. So in a broader context, when we look at your presentation of as an ePortfolio, how is it a true representation of who you are? How is it a true representation of the direction you want to go as an engineer? But more importantly, when we think about your sense of professionalism, what does that look like, right? And so we see that in many different examples here. So the one on the upper left is a student who worked in Finley and worked 3 semesters at Marathon, and it tells a story of the company, right? The one on the upper right, this is an example of an introduction of her portfolio. In the text, she talked about why she wanted to be an engineer. Okay, and so again, you could take this in many different directions. The lower left example is a page, or actually a piece of evidence from a student work on building a vehicle. Okay, and then the one on the lower right is an example of um, a portfolio reflection of a student working a problem. Okay, and so I'll go over where you could access these portfolios in a moment. So when you frame your experiences, there are 3 questions to ask yourself. What, right? What's the important piece of information? What happened while you were on co-op? What did you do, right? Building on that, it's the so what, okay? So first, you did the cursory descriptive reflection. Now it's this idea of affect. Why is this important to you? But more importantly, communicating to the viewer, meaning me, why is it important to you, right? And so understanding for yourself why is it important, and then communicating why that's important to the viewer is important, because is the message consistent, right? That's the thing to keep in mind. And then here are some prompts to sort of ask yourself. What did you learn while on co-op? What are you most proud of while you're on co-op? What would you have done differently? So, like, if you were explaining a situation where you were doing problem solving, you're providing drafts and drawings and scenarios, what would you have done differently? Right. But again, go back to the previous question. So what? Why is that important for me to know? Right. In the end, now what? Right. What would you do because of this? What would you do because of the experience that you had while on co-op? When you look at your portfolio in its entirety, right? What do you hope to gain moving forward, right? Again, is that consistent with the message that you're trying to communicate of what an engineer should be, or what is engineering? Okay. So some questions to keep in mind. What, so what, now what? What did you do? Why is it important? And what are you going to do as a result of it? Those are 3 basic questions to ask yourself when thinking about your experiences, right? So one of the things I want for you to do right now is After everything that I've shared with you, and if you would put that in the chat, what biographical information is important to your audience? When we think about biographical information, sometimes it also may include where are you attending school? Okay, something to keep in mind. Next one, and again, put this in the chat. What skills, experience, and knowledge would you like to highlight? And a good question that Sean asked is perhaps a starting point for yourself, where you came from, right? But for many people, where does that point start? Does it start with high school? Does it start with your second co-op experience, or does it start as a first-year student, right? When we think about anything related to professionalism, that's one thing. But when we think about the experiences and skills, it also may include the hard skills, right, as relates to your engineering work, right? Because it also imparts what industry you're in or what industry you're moving towards, right? Familiarity with specific software, technology, those are important, right? Because it again shares who you are, but more importantly, what industry you're in, but and the direction you're going, right? Familiarity with regulations are really important too, as David mentioned, namely because if you're applying for a specific job that has specific clearances or specific certificates or licenses, that is important. Okay. Finally, um, the last question, is, and you don't have to put this in the chat, but what's the overall message that you want to give the viewer, right? Um, How will you guide your audience? That's the important thing. So as you're building your portfolio out, it is important to note what you want the viewer to see, but what do you want the viewer to know about you, right? That's the other part. When we think about that piece, it is controlling the message. It is guiding the viewer to the direction you want to take your portfolio. Okay. So with that, I will stop there. Um, and mention several things. One, um, if you have a portfolio already, and I'm going to call out the folks that are in the University Honors Program. And the reason why I know about you all because you have portfolios that you've developed, and that is because that is a requirement within the honors program. I remember because I used to work for the honors program and helped develop their ePortfolios program and platform years ago. If you are in the university honors program and you have an ePortfolio, you do not need to build a brand new one. Just add to what you have already. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Um, when we think about, what to include, how much to include, and so forth, if you're going to use it for something after this class, put as much into it as possible. So again, if you are considering going to graduate school, I strongly recommend that you put a lot into it because when we look at how portfolios are built and what you put into it, you're actually going to use that content as you develop your grad school applications and your professional statements, where you're going to be making those constant reflections of who you are. It may not be verbatim, but you have talking points within your ePortfolio that you can use for future essays and things of that nature. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. I do want to point out for you And I'm going to share my screen again. I do want to point out for you, the learning module has been posted in your class. The video for after today will go into the ePortfolio overview. I do have for you a resource, and that is listed in the syllabus. And it is actually the 2050 assignment portfolio in a web form. Okay, so I have for you the description of the ePortfolio assignment, and then on the upper right of the different tabs. Okay, so your About Me page would go here. Again, name your some things to include, your co-op experiences. I'm not looking for intense detail, but again, what's important for you as you develop as you describe each experience in general. What did you work on? Going back to that what, so what, now what, right? As part of what you worked on, can you provide proof of a technical or non-technical idea, research project, or theory or skill that you developed while there? Okay. And again, going back to the so what and now what questions. Why is this? Why is it? What's so important about it? Why is it important for you? And what perspective did it give you moving forward? Okay. One of the unique things about the portfolio is that you are all involved in other ways. So how does that play into your sense of identity as an engineer? So that page is required of you here. Okay. And then it doesn't have to be necessarily all UC related. It could be in somewhere, stuff that you've done in the community, right? The final piece are list of portfolios. It is password protected. It is Bearcats, all lowercase. And here are some examples of ePortfolios. Okay, so as an example here, I'll just copy and paste one. Jacob here did his ePortfolio in Wix, right? One of the things I will say when I look at his portfolio, he is he's all about boating. He has an interest in engine work, and so specifically in the marina industry. And so he has his experiences here listed. He has his skills. And then he does mention how he's involved. Okay. So that's an example of Jacob. Another one is Herdesh. Herdesh actually spent some time working for Tesla. But one of the things I will capture from his journey at UC has been how he's built on every experience. Okay, he talks about his co-ops at Tesla and Ransohoff. He because he was in the honors program, he did that year in review. Okay, and so something to keep in mind. Right? What questions do you have? Are there any questions? Okay. Once again, the password to access this page is Bearcats and all lowercase. You could copy and paste. The other thing to consider too is many of the websites are built using Wix or Weebly. If you want to go into technical detail and do a WordPress site, you're more than happy to. Yeah, the thing I want to point out also is consider your audience. Right now, it's just me, right? But who are the other potential audience members who will view this this portfolio? Okay. For those of you that signed NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. I will say this, I'm not looking for you to divulge company secrets. What I'm asking you to do is how you learned and developed as an engineer. You could talk blandly or broadly about specific products or projects that you worked on, but in another sense, if you were focused on a patented manufacturing process, just mention where you work, right? And talk about the skills that you learned, not the actual product or process. What skills did you learn as a result of being on this patented manufacturing process? Many of you learned project management skills. Many of you learned how to code. Many of you learned, insert platform or insert software. Okay. There was a question about should the student portfolio be added to your resume? Should the URL to your ePortfolio be added? That's entirely up to you. I'm not requiring it, but if you are, you're offering the employer an opportunity to view what you have. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. Students do have it on their resumes because it offers a secondary view for the employer, and it's up to the employer whether or not they want to go to the website or go to the URL. But oftentimes when students put a URL on their resume, it actually moves the conversation of not beyond what are you good at to how do you fit within the organization, or how do you fit with my team? So if you talk about your project management skills, the fact that you're Six Sigma certified, that you've gotten at least your green belt, and that you've done work using specific CRMs and ERPs, the company may think, okay, you have these skills and experience that is substantiated in the portfolio. What type of fit do you now bring to the organization or to the work group? Okay, so the benefit of having an ePortfolio and presenting the ePortfolio to an employer is actually you're moving the conversation and moving your candidacy to now talk about fit as opposed to the cursory skill acquisition and knowledge. Other questions? Okay. When it comes to the portfolio submission, it is through Canvas. And when we go back to the learning modules, let me quickly share my screen as the student. You would click ePortfolio Part 1. When you submit the assignment, all I'm asking for is your URL. Insert the URL and then click Submit, right? We only do this once. So it's important for everyone to post their URL the first time, and then we will grade based on the deadlines I've established for everybody. Okay. And don't forget to submit. Are there any lasting questions? Okay. So like I said, once the video is rendered, I will post this onto Canvas. Other than that, we'll see you next week. If you haven't done so already, get your PAL reports done. And then, and also if you haven't done so already, make sure you've completed the Clifton Strengths Assessment. That's something that we will do sometime next week, or actually for the next class. So thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.